I want to thank CEDA for the opportunity to speak today. I'm in the 5th week of my new job as the Chief Economist at CCI. So, I've used those 5 weeks to take a look at what's happening in this election campaign, and that's what I want to talk about today. You'll probably not be shocked to hear that a campaign with both sides promising jobs, jobs, jobs is not particularly helpful for state debt. But we'll get to that. At first, I want to talk about diversification. If you want to retweet the graphs that I'll be putting up in my presentation today, they'll be live tweeted out from my account, and you can see my handle on the next couple of slides. But first, let's talk about the perfect storm that's hit the WA economy. Just a few years ago, WA was the powerhouse of the Australian economy. Over the last decade, our economy grew by more than 60%, and today we are 40% of Australia's total exports. And this really is how prosperity has been created in WA. However, weak global growth and lacklustre natural resource pricing, as the two previous speakers have highlighted, coincided with the end of the construction phase for our major resource projects. The economy is now in transition, and while it does, it highlights one thing. We need to start thinking differently about how we manage the WA economy and our state finances. Infrastructure will need to be a key priority for any incoming government in WA. A coordinated long-term infrastructure plan, as recommended by CCI in our brief to the incoming government, will reinvigorate the construction industry whilst laying strong foundations for other sectors to grow. For example, infrastructure projects that expand our airports, eco-resorts, camping and cruise ship facilities will springboard growth opportunities in tourism. It's only once this infrastructure is in place that market development and branding activities by the state government will have the greatest impact. Vast amounts of capital will be required to fulfil the state's infrastructure needs over the next decade. Given the state government's budget and debt position, private investment should be considered for part funding of these projects through public-private partnership arrangements. Together, these partnerships can open new markets across the economy. As important as diversification is, we should nevertheless remain mindful to play to our strengths and avoid policies that inhibit the attractiveness of further investment into natural resources in WA. The cyclical nature of the resources industry, combined with our expansive natural resource reserves, hint to us the opportunity for future resource projects will come again. So, in the meantime, both sides of politics need to commit to doing everything they can to fortify our economy through diversification and building infrastructure to underpin economic growth. The problem is that WA is $41 billion in debt by 2020. That's almost the same amount as the revenue the state government receives each year. Our debt to revenue ratio is the highest of all the states. To make matters worse, we are forecast to have deficits in every year in the forward estimates over the next 4 years. We're going to struggle to get out of debt without a structural change. How did we get here after an historic period of business investment? And what can the incoming state government, or any incoming state government, do to fix the situation? Well, let's look at the principles of budget deficits and surpluses. At the most fundamental level of economic principles, a government should attempt to run a balanced budget. A balanced budget means the state is taxing workers and businesses the right amount so it can deliver services to its citizens. Surpluses means the government is taxing too much, and deficits means the government is either spending too much or not taxing enough. Right now, the government would have you believe that WA has a tax problem, that we don't have enough tax revenue. Well, taxation isn't the problem. There are a few different ways to judge if a government is taxing appropriately. In WA, we can compare ourselves to the rest of the country. These figures are straight from the government's own budget, and they show the comparison of taxation to gross state product on the left, taxation per person in the middle, and tax effort on the right. Tax effort measures how much the state is taxing if we were to normalise the rate by the average of all the states. So as you can see, we have a very high economic output per person, due in large part to our resource exports, which means we're high taxing per head, but low taxing per economic output. This is normal for a resources exporting state, and the tax effort shows that we're taxing at an optimal level in comparison to other states. We can conclude that WA doesn't have a taxing problem. WA has a spending problem. As you can see here, the increases in recurrent spending has been the long-standing problem for WA governments. While increases in government spending have raced ahead in the Barnett government, this government has still had a lower average growth rate than the previous Labor government. The debate comes back to population growth, that the government needs to spend more and more to keep up with all the additional people it has to provide services to. This is partly true, but it's not the full story. It's certainly correct to say that WA's population growth has spiked. We can see here that overseas migration has been the leading factor in the growing number of people calling WA home. And with a surge in population, the government needs to provide an increased number of services to these people. So, to get to the bottom of whether the increase in spending is justified by population growth, we need to look at revenue and expenditure per head in WA. This graph shows that for every person in WA, it shows how much the government has pulled in as revenue per person compared to how much it has spent each year. It also accounts for inflation on both the revenue and expenditure sides of the equation. So neither the population growth or inflation arguments hold true up to this graph. If the government had simply kept up spending in line with population growth and inflation, then the light blue bars would be flat across this graph. Instead, they rise considerably. State revenue is quite variable, and this is due to the boom and bust cycles in WA business investment, as well as the variability of royalties, which make up about 20% of our state revenue. Even though we know this revenue is variable, WA governments continue to set their revenue expectations at the high points, forecasting balanced budgets when iron ore is over $100. We simply don't have the sustained increase in revenue to support it. What we can also observe is state debt per person shown as a line. It has grown significantly as a result of our government spending, well beyond what we can afford. While it's crucial to continue to build the state through infrastructure, it's not sustainable to hold $41 billion in debt, or more than $15,000 per person in WA. If you ever need to explain the WA's deficit in just two graphs, then these are it. This is our expenses and revenue growth average over the last decade. The decade average of expenses growth is 7.3% per year, while revenue is just 4.7%. We are consistently spending more than we are receiving in revenue. And this is because we continue to set our revenue expectations at the high point, and this has to change. Speaking of spending problems, let's look at what's been committed to this election. Both sides have announced relatively similar amounts of commitments. Infrastructure and transport are key themes of promises in this election, with around $3.5 billion committed by both sides. Health and education make up the next two largest groups. Job creation is the name of the game, and with WA's unemployment figures coming in today at 6.5%, for WA, you can understand why. Yesterday, the Liberals announced they would raise the payroll tax threshold by $50,000 to $900,000. This would create around 450 jobs in the private sector. This has long been campaigned for by CCI, as job creation in the private sector through payroll tax cuts is a much more efficient way to create jobs and much more effective for the budget. It's much cheaper than creating jobs in the public sector because the private sector picks up most of the tab. Still, you wouldn't believe the state had $3 billion in deficit this year and was heading towards $41 billion in debt by 2020, looking at this. The problem with too much debt is that it makes life incredibly difficult for a government. There are three direct consequences of this debt in this campaign. The first is that election promises are less likely to be fulfilled because the money just isn't there to fund them. This weakens faith in our democracy, the last thing we need in the current global political climate. The second is our AAA credit rating. It's long gone, and until spending is reined in, it's not coming back. The third and most damaging of all is the dangerous proposals that are put up by nervous politicians trying to secure a quick fix without thinking about the ramifications of their policies. The Nationals' proposal to raise the iron ore royalty in state agreements from 25 cents to $5 to pay off debt and fund infrastructure will have a net negative effect on WA. It'll hurt small business small and medium-sized businesses throughout the value chain. Poorly considered policies like this will continue to come up until the debt is paid off. The major parties understand this, so what are they planning to do about it? Well, there are some saving measures being announced. Labor have committed to reducing the most senior band of bureaucrats by 20% and reducing the number of government agencies as recommended by CCI prior to the last state budget. The Liberals have committed to partially sell Western Australia's poles and wires, Western Power, which is expected to raise $11 billion. Labor leader Mark McGowan has stated that if elected, Labor will repay debt slowly and carefully, like paying off a house. It sounds like an easy thing to do, paying something off over such a long period of time. Well, we've run the numbers on both proposals to show you what their debt repayments would look like. First of all, total debt will be $41 billion by 2020. That's our starting point. By that time, interest payments on the debt will likely exceed $1 billion, making it one of the largest expenses in the budget. Labor first. The usual home buyer signs up to a 30-year loan. So let's assume Labor's intention is to pay off debt over a 30-year time horizon. That's a pretty generous time to pay off the debt. Now, before I put up this next chart, I need to put out a major disclaimer. The state debt is made up by Treasury bonds, which do not operate like a house mortgage. I'm sure Mike McGowan understands this. They have very varying maturity dates and variable rates of interest which change over time, which make the repayments lumpy, unlike a mortgage. So we've taken some assumptions to simplify the example, but we know that the debt will need to continue to be refinanced, so the principles of the debt remain the same. Let's see how Labor's debt repayment effort would look. So paying down debt over 30 years will require Labor to find $1.8 billion a year in instalments. That's on top of rebalancing the budget, where a further $3 billion in savings need to be found to return the budget to surplus. It means that if we're going to believe that Labor has the capacity to repay debt, like a house, they need to announce a total of $1.8 billion in budget savings, and possibly as much as $4.8 billion if they don't adopt the saving measures already included in the budget from the Liberals. Over the weekend, Labor announced the creation of a debt repayment account that will be funded by iron ore royalties. The conditions for paying down debt in their proposal were that the price of iron ore had to be over $85 a tonne and GST relativity had to be over 65 cents in the dollar. GST relativity is currently around 30 cents in the dollar. The problem with this approach is that GST and iron ore royalties move in opposite directions. As iron ore goes up, GST receipts come down thanks to the Commonwealth Grants Commission's redistribution. Since the year 2000, there have been only 2 years when Labor's debt repayment conditions were met. And over the forward estimates, there are 0 years when these conditions will be met. This means that over a 20-year horizon, Labor would accumulate funds to pay down debt in just 2 years. Had their fund been operating that time, Labor would have paid down just $3.9 billion in debt over 20 years, which in the context of $41 billion in debt is a drop in the ocean. It's not even enough to cover the interest. If we are to believe Mark McGowan can get the state debt under control, they need to announce another $1.5 billion in savings each year. So in my assessment, Labor hasn't presented a credible, believable plan to pay down debt. The savings announced by Labor don't even cover the interest payments on the debt today. Let's take a quick look at the Libs. Their debt plan is to partially sell off Western Power. The partial sale of our poles and wires will net around $11 billion for the state, of which the Liberals have stated $8 billion will go to paying down debt and $3 billion will go to infrastructure. Assuming the Liberals commit to their existing spending growth restrictions, then the same repayments that Labor has to find will have the Liberals paying the debt off in 20 years, a decade earlier than Labor. This should make it absolutely clear that the sale of Western Power is essential if we want to pay down government debt. Labor has hinted that they have more to say on debt repayment. If we are to believe the pay it off like a house proposal will work, they still need to announce an additional $1.5 billion in savings per year on top of their $0.2 billion that they've announced already. They have a long way to go. Considering all of the announcements that have been made to date, we have a simple choice, I believe, as we head to the ballot box. Vote for the party that put the state $41 billion into debt, but have a credible plan to pay it off. Or vote for the party who didn't create the debt, but don't yet have a plan to fix it. If you want to make Western Australia a world-leading place to live and to do business, we need to have the funds to continue to build this state's infrastructure. Without the sale of Western Power, we simply won't be able to maintain our place in the world as a leading place to live and to work. Thanks.